Hi everyone. Uh, First off, um, I think this sucks. I've been sat here for a while trying to think of how I'm supposed to talk to a computer and what something like that is supposed to mean for me as a philosopher, and it's really difficult. Um, because, well, I got the sense trying to prepare for this, and it was almost like a quip, a truism that one could write down. Um, and so I captured it on paper as a title. But there were a couple other titles, and I already spoke one of them. And it was "Why I Hate That I Am Doing This" is one title. Uh, Second title is "Look at What a Destitute Time Forces a Philosopher to Do." And the aforementioned quip that I'll now spill is Socrates only exists in speech. Um, so I'll try to unpack those sentiments a little bit. The whole attempt here is to try and relate um, in a way that shows you who I am, but expose the difficulties of attempting to show somebody or a group of people who I am without actually having anyone there face to face to speak to. Because, like, um, part of my thinking, part of the problem for me is philosophy, being a philosopher, is supposed to be a kind of way of relating among people, or a kind or style of relationship among people. So, like, we have pictures, of course, of like professors and students. Um, it's kind of a knowledge or power based scenario. There are the things that the student wants to know, and the things presumably that the teacher or the professor wants to teach the student. So there's power and knowledge and desire in there, and there's also faith, insofar as like one presupposes that the professor or the teacher actually has something to teach, um, and inversely that the student has something to learn. So it's a kind of philosophy is a kind of relating, a way of relating that's in a sense self-conscious, and I'll try to unpack that. I'll probably have lots to say about it as time goes on. So I want to just right out the gates. I don't think that philosophy is like a kind of theoretical system that you can just kind of draw on in order to do philosophy. It's something that happens in communion, in community, not in a vacuum. So to unpack a little bit now about that Socrates only existing in speech thing is uh, um, the disposition or the capacity to be philosophical is something that for what I understand about a character like Socrates. I'm not specifically talking about Socrates. I'm trying to be general and speak to a caricature of that kind of person, or that kind of idea. Uh, the idea of that kind of person is that they're not sat around thinking about what the ultimate truth of things is. Um, they are possessed of a kind of knowing, but of a kind of knowing that also admits that they don't know. So this knowing is when and how to chime in philosophically, and this not knowing is also an admittance of not really having any kind of system or plans in advance that one brings to the table when they enter into a philosophical community or relationship in speech when communicating. Um, So, like, just to continue philosophy, I don't think of as a theoretical system or a set of procedures or tools that exists concretely in advance of its deployment or its style of deployment. In other words, it's something that uh, has to take up an idiosyncratic shape in order to form itself to its subject matter or to its students or to its audience. Because that student, audience, or subject matter itself has an idiosyncratic shape. one that has its own styles of faith and belief, one that has its own approach and grips on something like power, knowledge, desire, etc. So a philosopher, in some sense, is something that arises in speech and shapes itself to kind of meet the needs or the addresses of somebody else. It happens in community and communication and doesn't have a preset form. But then why isn't a philosopher somebody who is merely a conversationalist? The reason that I think we can ask that is there's got to be something extra that the philosopher actually does or actually knows beyond just being able to ask peculiar questions in the middle of conversation or trying to be interesting in the middle of conversation or at worst merely attempting to be sophisticated or convincing in conversation. So supposedly there would be a kind of knowing that is possessed of a kind of understanding of not knowing. So to continue with that kind of Socratic gesture of not knowing, of knowing that one does not know, it would be a position of not knowing that this. It's a position of not knowing the student or the audience or the subject matter. So, oh man, I'm trying to recap the point that I had here. Okay, yeah, I see. It was just a grammatical thing I'd written. So, a kind of understanding of not knowing is a kind of diagnostic grasp of what it means to be ignorant, or what ignorance is, or what it means to not yet be in the position of having a knowing. So when Socrates encounters somebody who does not know, or does not yet know, or is in a not knowing of some sense, that is when Socrates comes into being, because the person's ignorance in some sense has presented itself, and Socrates arises out of speech in contrast to this not knowing as a kind of therapeutic, but only after a kind of diagnostic understanding of how the other person does not know something has already been set forth through kind of Socratic questioning. So Socrates kind of knows when and how to chime in. That kind of picture can't be done here. That's part of the issue of trying to speak to a computer, because I don't know my audience. I don't know, pardon me, I don't know my ignorance. I don't know your ignorance, and hence a kind of philosophical, therapeutic, diagnostic gaze or persona can't really come into being in a kind of truly relational sense. It would be something that is merely out on display in the sense of preaching. Because if I don't know my audience and I don't have to know who each of them are in order to be able to say what I have, it means that I've got something to say in advance, and I would be akin to somebody on a box, on a corner, spouting off about, I don't know, whatever. They would just be preaching. They would have their message set up in advance and would just be laying it out without any regard for who's going to hear it, or curtailing themselves to the the appropriate context of what they're trying to present themselves in. So I'm either preaching, or at this point I'm high and dry for a subject matter, because I'm not sure who I'm speaking to. Because for me, I'm just speaking to a computer. There's no personal relationship here, so we can't even begin to talk about something like subjects of interest until we're on the same page to some extent, or maybe to put differently, until you know the philosophical context that I'm coming out of. How could we be on the same page about a philosophical relationship or a discussion? Then at the same time, how can I lay out where I'm coming from without merely being a preacher and perhaps alienating myself and others, and exposing that we perhaps don't have much in common philosophically, whatever philosophy means at that point, that would allow us to not have anything in common through it. So I'm high and dry without a subject matter. But the subject matter would be the kind of philosophical relationship that we could have, and we could discuss something like that. So I do have that kind of subject matter, just not with y'all, just not with the presumed alien listeners who I haven't met or don't know. Um, I have philosophical relationships that can serve as the subject matter at that point. So I can, for example, think of conversations that I've had with friends, um, coworkers, family members, relationships where they or myself are in the position of having more or less knowledge, being in a position of desire, of wanting something that the other has, or wanting to conform to what the other expects me to conform to. So I've been in philosophical situations that I could draw on as a subject matter that would allow me to explicate what my philosophy is, but at that point I would kind of be taking a position, unlike preaching, where it's me here and you over here and me kind of talking past you. It would be more like acting at that point, where I'm trying to think of somebody who I've already had this style of conversation with, and then I'm drawing on that and kind of hypothetically speaking to them, entertaining their position, going back with it for myself, kind of reiterating it back and forth, having dialectic, I guess you could call it, discussion. But it would no longer be between me and you, relating between me and you as an audience. It would be me relating to myself, kind of just on screen. So I wouldn't be preaching, I would be acting. So here's the kind of problem that I'm in. Preaching denies the relationship that I want to have with the broader philosophical community, with philosophical people in general. And at the same time, acting denies that relationship that I want to be able to have. So what this suggests is either it's not clear to y'all what philosophy is, such that when I say something like that, it's not clear how I'm trying to approach you, or I've supposed that everybody's got such a idiosyncratic personal idea of what philosophy is, or a picture in their head of what philosophy is, such that when I say, I'm a philosopher, let's do philosophy and so forth, that y'all might not understand what that is because of that kind of multiple interpretations of what's going on here. So preaching and acting suggest that I don't know what y'all think philosophy is, and I'm not even sure which side of the relationship that lack of knowledge is on, because y'all aren't here and I'm talking to a computer. So this is a kind of destitute situation. It seems that there's no way that I can tell you about myself and what I think about things without, in some sense, negating the very attempt to relate to y'all. But even further, this harkens on the destitution of our time, because when I say philosophy and the fact that it results in a potential series of different interpretations suggests that we don't have a common cultural, social, historical touchstone for what is implied here. And even among educated philosophers, you'll get as many different answers as you're willing to sit and listen for. So like, on one level, I think some philosophers would suggest that the capacity for this kind of infinite interpretation of what philosophy is a strength of philosophy, because like I suggested before, it's something that's truly idiosyncratic, personal. So we would expect it to have a different definition person to person. Whereas on the other hand, this kind of would suggest that it belies a kind of communal capacity, that if everybody has a different idea of what philosophy is, how are we to be on the same page? And if there's not something suggestive of a common philosophy that gets us on the same page, how are we supposed to come out of our personal spheres to address each other without preaching or without acting? It's kind of a destitute time. What the philosophers are, what the philosophers do, what the roles are, what our relationship to philosophers and their roles is supposed to be, is not overly apparent. I would suppose that some people think that philosophers ought to be holding higher positions in society. Even some great philosophers might have suggested that it's better off that philosophers aren't in charge or have no high positions in society. Some contemporary thinkers might even suggest that philosophers don't have any role, that this is kind of a washed up line of thought or something. So I have no readily available shared context to draw on to know whether we'll all be able to relate in advance. So that's the kind of lived vagueness of what it is to talk to a computer screen. That's kind of what it means, is that I have no idea where to start. I have no idea how to approach y'all. To go back to the titles, this is what philosophers are forced to do in destitute times. I hate it that I have to seek community in a medium or an atmosphere or a time that doesn't seem to have a common understanding of what a project like that would entail under the banner of something like philosophy. But I would want to make a posit at this point, or at least a suggestion, and say that philosophy allows us to think not merely of things in terms of being means to ends or in terms of products, final results, but can allow us to think of things that, I don't really have a word for this, that are discovered tacitly along the way, or that you already know or do without your knowledge of you knowing or doing it, or how something that is supposedly non-philosophical or is lacking a philosophical relation tacitly in some sense already is possessed of a philosophical relation. So what I'm trying to get at here is not knowing how to present myself by traversing the impossibility and the contradictions of attempting to begin to relate to you philosophically, by traversing the impossibility of beginning something like that, where I can't preach and I can't act. I tacitly began by addressing that I couldn't do something out the gates and the awkwardness and the tension of it. I exposed who I actually was. Somebody who's talking to a computer and doing their best to do so. So I exposed myself. So as opposed to like this first moment of attempting to relate actually negating my capacity to relate to y'all, it's actually the first moment of my capacity to relate, because it's the very act of acting. I know, awful. The very fact that I've acted is my exposure to you. That if I didn't do that, there would be no attempt. There would be no relation. So if this video weren't being watched, listened to, recorded even right now, there would not be that act of attempting to relate. Hence, no exposure. Hence, the possibility of relating is not fulfilled, and we don't relate. So even though the possibility of preaching and acting annuls the relation, or exposes it to contradiction and impossibility, it is also necessarily the first moment of attempting to relate to you. So in some sense, I can't go too fast and presume to know you. That's another one of the meanings here that is present in speaking to a computer. I don't know my audience, but then at the same time, I can't presume to know my audience. I can't go fast and presume to know who you are, such that I could just tell you who I am and what my philosophical projects and aspirations and ideas are. It kind of had to be done in a roundabout, tacitly exposing way. And there's also hopefully a kind of like a play at what I was trying to get at with Socrates earlier regarding not knowing, because I hope that this is a kind of demonstration of a kind of knowledge of not knowing. So what that means is, if it seemed impossible to know the way forward earlier regarding preaching or acting, I presumably demonstrated a kind of knowledge of that tension, that impossibility, that contradiction, and knew how to traverse it in a way that allowed me to kind of expose its necessity. So even though it seemed like a contradiction, it actually seems to be something like a way forward. The very fact that I can't go straight to you with preaching or acting, when I admit that, is actually the basis for our relationship, because in some sense it demonstrates that I know where I'm coming from, and it suggests that I'm doing something like that in good faith. I'm putting my cards on the table right out the gates, or to put differently, I'm showing y'all that my hands are empty. There are no cards there to begin with. So when we seem stuck, there's this kind of knowledge of not knowing that is capable of exposing the necessary moments that have actually been traversed in the impossibility, and show that the impossibility is actually a way forward. So this is the first moment of putting myself out there. I'm trying to show you how I think. Next heading, look at what we're forced to do, kind of continuing with that tone. And continuing with this, like, okay, we can get to a new point of me simply exposing myself to you in a way that isn't preaching, in a way that isn't acting, but it's not just a kind of pure exposure of who I am. Like, y'all aren't getting my pure essence on display, my theoretical philosophical persona all at once. You're getting, it's still a contradiction, it's still something that has to be worked through, and we're moving through them, preaching, acting, and now advertising. Look at what I'm forced to do as a philosopher in this destitute time. It's a kind of charade. It's a kind of dance without a partner or without a subject matter. It's kind of a higher version of preaching, but now possessed of a subject matter where now I'm selling you something. Now I've got something to say, or now I've got a picture of philosophy that to you is starting to take shape a little bit, and maybe it's intelligible, maybe it's not. But now it's on the level of advertising, because there's a content that I'm trying to give you that isn't merely just me preaching indiscriminately. So here's a kind of problem in philosophy. I think it's a problem that philosophy kind of yields itself to economic forces or economic or technological ways of thinking. So a philosophy that sells you something might be another one of those things that turns into its opposite or immediately contradicts what it's attempting to do. So, like, I'm reiterating things that I've had good professors tell me. A philosophy that teaches you how to argue, or pitches itself on how to be logical or how to think critically, is a philosophy that has some particular end in mind. It's actually trying to sell you something. It wants you to win arguments. It wants you to have a theory in advance that you can deploy in any scenario, and just follow out the criteria or the steps in the theory, and whatever you encounter will be able to kind of fit into it, or you'll be able to respond to it, or launch a rebuttal of some kind. To me, this is part of the problem of destitution, where if people have a picture of a philosopher in advance that's other than what I'm trying to be, then in a sense I'm missed, because I don't consider myself trying to sell anything or pitch anything, or to have some kind of end in mind that I want to be able to hand on that you could do in advance. So I at once have to do this charade of, hey, I've got something that you might want, but then at the same time saying, yeah, we're not moving towards any particular end in mind, as though you're a tool, or my theory is a tool, and I can use you or my theory to get to the ultimate end or goal of a project. A philosophy like that seems to, borrowing the line, turn over into its opposite. It winds up being something that doesn't consider the conditions and the horizons within which philosophical life takes place. So I think I'll try to capture what that means at this point. Philosophy is a kind of way of thinking. It's a way of living. It's not a product. It's not a product that one pitches, and I'm not pitching a product, nor am I pitching something new. I don't think that I'm saying anything new. I don't think that suggesting that philosophy is a way of life as opposed to a theory is something overly radical. But what is it then if it's like this vagueness of a way of life? What is it that one advertises, and what is it that one advertises with? If I'm not selling something, I don't have a book to give y'all. I don't have 12 rules to give y'all. I don't have a technique to win arguments or how to pwn noobs in arguments. I can't tell you how to be logical in advance in all situations or what that would even mean. I can't tell you how to control people and how to convince people with your arguments so that you can get things that you want. The vagueness of claiming that philosophy is a way of life is overcome by being a certain kind of persona. If it's not a product that I could hand over to you, it's my very self. It's my very spiritedness. It's the very thing that's in excess about me that may or may not be in other people who are philosophically spirited. So I am the product and the advertisement that in putting myself out here without a subject matter and without a product, like to hand over in that sense, I presumably come up as suspicious or unnecessarily mysterious or obscurantist or irrelevant, because it's what's this person saying? They've got something to say, but they're not going to say it in advance. They want to be able to relate to us, but they're not going to say what the nature of that relation is or where they're really coming from. They're just going to continue to try to put it on display by continually moving through just a line of thought. Yeah, that's right. One of the only things that I think a philosopher can do or add to another person's life is to take up a line of thought. And I think that's what some great philosophers I think have been claimed to be able to do. It's like I've heard stories of like philosophers in lecture halls, and they get their head locked down for like 10 minutes, and it's not that everybody is bored in the room, but the atmosphere is incredibly tense. It's obvious that a great amount of systematic cognitive effort is going into whatever the professor or the philosopher is thinking or attempting to respond to. So there's a kind of spiritedness that certain individuals have or carry or are capable of that I don't think is obscure or suspicious or mysterious. It's a different way of being. It's a certain way of life. It's a way of being an individual that is utterly thoughtful, utterly caring, utterly systematic. And that's kind of what I mean by spirited in a systematic or in a technical sense. Is that it's systematic? Is that it's comprehensive? Is that it tries to think thoroughly outside the bounds of how its presentation might be limited at any particular point in time. So advertising, YouTube advertising, YouTube philosophy, punditry is something that's, well, the scale is something that's very contemporary, so that's like something that the philosopher has to take stock of and respond to and know how to be able to keep a line of thought in relation to and in antagonism to, without being suspicious or obscure or irrelevant. So there are all kinds of challenges in just attempting to be intelligible in this claim that one can philosophize without it being a theory, but is something that is like a way of life or taking up a certain kind of persona or spirit. Might seem like a gear change at this point, but it's something that I forgot to mention in the beginning. One of the reasons that I've taken this up is because people have asked me to. I've had several friends suggest that philosophical personas need to be more apparent or abundant or explicit or obvious or critical in new mediums these days. So it's like, get out there for this reason, philosopher, is some of the things that have been suggested, like people don't think critically enough, or we don't think about the big important questions anymore. So you need to get out there, philosopher, as a means to an end, as a tool to get people to think critically, or get people to think more broadly about big questions again, or something like that. And on one level, that's part of the problem that philosophy is thought of as a kind of tool that could do this. Because if it's not a product or a critique or a technique of any kind, then it's not like a wedge that you can just drive into some pool of people or ideology that isn't overly thoughtful. So part of the problem of asking the philosopher to be able to do anything affective like that is that philosophy is not a means to an ends like that. Interestingly, that left me in a place that was a ready excuse, where it's okay, if philosophy isn't a tool, then there's no way for me to just kind of deploy this, whatever this is, as a hammer to try to get y'all to take philosophy up in some kind of peculiar or sensational way. There's no way for me to... sorry, I've lost my place a little bit. I think I'll just move on within the same point, though. Right, the excuse thing. If there's no way for philosophy to function as a tool, then doing something like this is essentially useless. It would be unintelligible, but then at the same time, I would be part of the destitution if I've got an idea of what philosophy is and think that some kind of reason would come along that would thereby enable me to come online and do this. So ultimately, what brought me to doing this today was realizing that I have no reason at all to do this. I can't come up with a reason for myself to want to be sat here doing something that I hate, just to use the strong words, because there's nobody here in front of me who I could actually relate to. But at the same time, if I needed a reason to be here, that sets me in that kind of, oh, what's the means to the end desire thing again. Like if I need a reason to be here and a reason to be doing this, then presumably that reason is whatever the goal or the end in mind would be, or the motivation for it. And in that sense, I'm not doing it wholly for the sake of just doing it. I would be caught in that destitution of merely being able to think technologically in means to ends, where I'm merely advertising something, where I'm merely selling you how to argue or how to think critically. So I'm here now without a reason for being here, other than I told my friend that I would actually go through with it. There's a little bit of backstory there, so like maybe I could put some persona on the line and not follow what I've already written to a T. I did 4 or 5 years philosophy as an undergraduate at university, and I used to be incredibly anxious, withdrawn person socially, and I used to attend philosophy club as a way to challenge myself, to get a little more social, to suggest to myself that maybe I actually have something to say in a group of people, and it went well. I wasn't as mad and as lonely as I thought. But this philosophy club, I think it was like 4 or 5 years ago now, it was just the other day, so what is this, early November, Halloween was the day, about 4 or 5 years ago, when I got to lead my first lecture, seminar, discussion, and it was at Philosophy Club at university. Um, so being 4 years down the line, and I've just recently, for a different philosophy club, regurgitated that topic from 4 years ago for this philosophy club. I did a presentation basically on the same thing. Um, so all of that was in the air around the same time of year, end of October. Uh, so that's when I did my first lecture, was on Halloween 4 years ago. So it just passed. The anniversary of that just passed, and wouldn't you know, one of my friends hit me up on Halloween and said, "Start doing these kind of things. People don't think critically, etc." And I said, um, yeah, that's Providence. I'll heed that call and look at the stars lining up, not seriously in that sense, but kind of poetically, as a way of giving myself a non-reason to go through with it. So I'm here now doing this slightly after October, because there's just a bunch of stuff that came up with family and friends that just kind of waylaid this period of time, a couple days. So this was supposed to be on October, and at the end of October, but it's about a week late now. But it's getting done, and it's still the inspiration, still the same inspiration carrying it forward. Um, anyway, to continue, uh, why I hate that I'm doing this. To continue with that, because the whole thing about philosophy not being a theory is that we're supposed to be able to relate. So I want to be able to show you my spiritedness, my persona, my personality, and in person, in speech together, like reciprocally, back and forth in communion, in communication. We could go straight to trying to show each other who we are by asking questions. Sorry, yeah, asking questions, answering, communicating discursively and charitably. We could get a sense of who the other is, what their commitments are, what their likely set of activities are, what their interests are, and that would be readily available. But here I have to do the absurd act that at once tries to show you that I'm different enough from the things that we regularly hear to perhaps find important, that if I'm different from what other people are saying and hearing, like friends would suggest, or like I would hope, then I have to do this absurd act and gesture that makes myself relatable, while at the same time not spilling all of my beans and pretensions about what I think that I'm doing, so as to alienate people, and perhaps avoid alienating myself from them. Because if I have pretensions that are other than what you think philosophy is, then we'll talk past each other, because you'll either disagree with me, or they won't even register as philosophical to you, and we won't be intelligible to each other. So part of why this is awful is because I have to do balancing acts for an audience that I don't even know. Ideally, be teaching in an atmosphere that didn't milk my soul by turning me, and therefore my way of doing philosophy, into something else. But I have to at once admit that I have a way of doing it without putting it wholly out there so that it could be turned into something else. So this has to move slowly in a sense, and there's no way to do it right, and there's no way for me to just spill all my beans if there's nobody to spill my beans into in particular, i.e. Nobody who I could Socratically form myself to idiosyncratically so as to relate myself to them appropriately. That can't be done here. That would ideally be done in a kind of self-conscious culture. I think that this is a broad, vague way to put it, and I'll change definitions on the daily. I think, without contradicting myself, but that's left to be seen based on what we think the nature of definitions are and what we think the nature of this persona supposedly is. I think that philosophy is a kind of self-conscious culture, a self-conscious enculturation. So insofar as it's a way of relating and communing with each other, it's a kind of imminent possibility. It's a possible way of living alongside each other uh, communally that, here's the key term, it is traditional. Not in the sense of like appealing to a past tradition that's kind of gone its own ways already, but in the sense of philosophy generates community, and in that sense has characters and rights and ways of behaving, and in that sense is a tradition. So this might just be me, because I don't hear other people talking about philosophy like this. And maybe philosophy used to be done like this, or maybe the sciences and humanities used to be done like this, and it was one of those things that everyone was kind of doing, but wasn't really sure of what that they were doing it. But it's like, I've lost my place. I think I was trying to describe how I thought of philosophy as a self-conscious culture, and in particular I was trying to focus in on the idea of tradition, because like, right, that's what I was trying to get at. I haven't seen this line of thinking elsewhere, but my sense is that my professors were doing this kind of Socratic thing that I've been describing of fitting themselves to where they figured my needs were at a certain time in my philosophical development. And in that sense, by fitting themselves to me like that, I got to see what the kind of pedagogical strategy or structure was for them, and tacitly, in that sense, got where they were coming from in their approach to me. Not in a kind of immanent mind reading way, but in a kind of, I think I know where you're coming from, and we both have our tongue in our cheek and a gleam in our eye about the same things. So there's a kind of latching on to the spiritedness of the other, where I think of philosophy as a tradition in this literal sense of in the sense of passing a candle on, the poetic sense, not literal, where some individuals think, they light their own flames, they become autonomous, where some witness some think and are lit by them, not willfully, not as a means to an end, but as that imminent possibility that when you're in the presence of a philosopher in a tradition, so a philosopher as somebody within a philosophical tradition, there are only philosophers in philosophical traditions. When somebody's around somebody like that, they're more likely to become philosophical. Their personality exudes that kind of traditional disposition where the people around them kind of latch on to the way of thinking, the way of life that the philosopher at the foot of the tradition is kind of carrying it forward in time. You can't pass a tradition on through a computer. I'm not sure. I think this is one of the peculiar questions of the time, is like, how important is medium? Like, presumably you could keep a tradition going classroom to classroom, university to university, and kind of keep this sense of a self-conscious culture going, and of people self-consciously generating their culture. You could kind of keep those kind of things going. But that can't be done, or sorry, the question is whether that can be done in something like a medium like the computer, where it's, are y'all going to get the flame here? is there a flame here? Do y'all have a flame to pass on here? And do we think of what we're doing as philosophers or thinkers as a tradition, as a life lived, and as opposed to being a systematic or comprehensive theory, a systematic or comprehensive persona? Um, yeah, hard stop there. Wanted to move on to something that my friend asked me as an attempt to get me to do this. What is philosophy supposed to be doing at a time when you can just get called a cuck online? Easy answer is that you go and do this kind of awkward, terse thing, and make philosophy videos, or at least try to get the ball rolling on something like that, so that the level of discourse has the bar raised. So the way that I was taught philosophy like this and a kind of self-conscious enculturation like this was that there are people who are better at it. So like, I've heard it put poetically, there are people who are just called to doing philosophy and being philosophers. So there are some people who are just better at it. So like, one identifies the people at the top of the class. One has an eye out for people of a kind of similar or high philosophical disposition. Philosophy, I think, in a time when you can just get called a cuck online, is, again, that's that destitution thing of we don't even know what philosophy is. We don't even have a discursive bar that we could set that would say, all those people who just devolved to name calling, you're not being taken seriously. But then at the same time, what kind of philosophy needs to exist to be able to recognize the voice of those kind of people who would initially be discounted? So there's a dialectic here in the idea of being able to raise a bar or teach to the upper end of a class, or at minimum preserve the possibility of there being a better way. And the dialectic there is one of elitism, because as soon as one endorses that there's a better way of doing things, a better at all, say somebody claims that better way, say they've actually achieved it, then there's this kind of peculiarity of like, do you look down on people? The people around you, do they feel looked down on just by the fact that you are trying to live this supposed better way of raising the bar beyond just merely calling each other names or suggesting that kind of thing ought not to be allowed, but then at the same time recognizing that people need to have their voices and concerns heard, regardless of how poorly we suppose them to be being made? So there's the dialectic here is one of being a hard-hearted asshole whose soul is too beautiful to get their hands dirty. That is, they leave all of the people who don't meet the bar, who don't meet the standard, behind. And I think that that's awful. That's exactly the kind of things that I see and hear happening in politics, where people refuse to hear the other person's side at all because they judge the other side to be completely obnoxious. Then at the same time, they won't say that, well, you're human and I'm going to try to give you a charitable pitch as to what it is that you're trying to say so that we can better represent what it is that we both want together. So in setting a higher bar or a better way, one has to engage in this problem of being elitist and of necessarily needing to be able to make concessions in order to bring people up alongside you. I think that this is actually a dialectic of forgiveness, where like you can fill in the blanks, because I think that there's kind of just an X and a Y here, and you'll fill them in regardless of which side you're on. So say one side wants to make a point politically that another group considers somewhat offensive, but they think that their freedom of speech provides them the right to be able to say something even if it's offensive, that they ought to be able to say it unencumbered. But then the other side comes along and says, no, the very fact that what you're saying is obnoxious and offensive disqualifies you from being heard, disqualifies you from entering on stage to be able to speak your piece. And the dialectic there could be pushed forward to be like, well, yeah, on some level we know that there are certain positions that are wrong at this point in time and don't deserve the light of day. Where do we set that bar? How do we set that bar? Who gets to set that bar? And those questions aren't supposed to be rhetorical or obnoxious. I want them to be practical, actually, because I think that we set the bar all the time. It's not like there's a kind of standard that it's like, okay, who do we go to figure out what the standard for our discourse is going to be, and then we all convene once a year and read the same book and get on the same page discursively. That obviously doesn't happen, but then we all admit that there is this kind of standard that either is to be broken or is in some sense to be upheld regarding discursive practices. So we do this all the time anyway. We can't help but do it. When we act, we set that bar. When somebody calls somebody else a cuck online or gets emotionally worked up to the point of not being able to continue on in speech together, they're setting that bar. All of our decisions set the bar. We're collectively setting that bar. And at once, if we're scared of being better, we'll never get there. And at the same time, if there are people who are actually better, who don't bring people up alongside them, we will also never get there. And being hard-hearted and unwilling or unable to engage with people just because you think you got it figured out and you're better now is part of the destitution, part of the problem. So there's a missing content here regarding what are you talking about regarding what are you talking about a better way? What do you mean by better way? So the question, how are we supposed to raise the bar and promote a better way without being elitist assholes and without being pretentious, but an authentically better way, in other words? I think it depends on the content of that better way. So how we answer the question of how to raise the bar or how to promote a better way, how we do that actually depends on what we consider that better way to be. So to answer my friend's question of what philosophy is supposed to be doing at a time when you can just get called a cuck online, and to provide some kind of content of what it would look like to preserve the possibility of a better way or a higher bar, to answer those questions would be to respond to the same thing. What are you supposed to do? You're supposed to set the bar to some extent. What is the setting a bar? That's still something yet to be decided that we can't wholly do at any point in time in advance because it requires you. It requires groups of people being able to talk to each other in a non-alienated way, in a way where they're making their culture together as a way of preserving their capacity to communicate and raise each other along the lines of this better way. I think there's a little bit of a kind of synthesis approaching here. So I wanted to continue now with the problem of not being able to offer myself up in any kind of advertisement sense, because I think that's where we left off. It was, okay, I'm preaching, or no, I have to act. Okay, no, this is advertising. Oh, no, I don't want it to be sophistry, but I have to advertise a way of life, and the only thing that I have for that is myself. I can't give you a book or rules or something like that. So if I'm claiming to be a philosopher wanting a philosophically affective community, then I have to do some philosophy. I have to show you my persona in and as its philosophical acts. And in a sense, this kind of rolls together all of the past moments that have already been traversed. So the act of preaching, the act of acting, like somebody on stage having a conversation with one of my friends in my head or something, or advertising, taking up a subject matter and pitching it to you like I have something to offer. When you roll all of those things together, preaching and entertaining or acting and advertising, you get a lecturer. You get somebody who's lecturing, where there's an element of faith in me that you sat here for this long and heard me babble on and get lost and skip things, etc. So there's an element of faith in me, like I discussed in the beginning, where there's somebody kind of approaching somebody who knows more than them, or that they're interested in, to try to figure out what it is that they have, or what it is that they could get out of the other as a content. So there's faith that I have a content. So there's that moment of preaching that isn't lost. There's the acting. So I have to be witty. I have to be rhetorical. I have to flourish. I have to speak with my hands. I have to do cognitive gestures that show that I'm wholly capable of being this philosophical persona, that if you needed me to step on stage and pretend to be a philosopher, that's what you would get. That kind of actor. I have to be continuous with that insofar as I'm lecturing or leading something discursive. But I also have to have faith in you, and that's where the advertising comes in, where I can put something out with a subject matter, but that's literally just a kind of expulsion. I have to have faith that in some sense this will have touched you, this will have made sense, this will have been intelligible, or at least it could be responded to. I have to have faith that in this advertising of myself that you will be able to hear, that this rhetoric is going on in a reciprocal fashion where you also have faith in me. And that puts us on the status of being in a lecture, that I always had the subject matter. So like, again, there's that problem of where do I begin? How am I supposed to just turn the camera on and start talking to a computer? Never having done that before, I'm supposed to take up the position that I would take up speaking generally to any group of people. And in this sense, tracing out all of the tensions and the considerations of what it means to do that in general for people, but now in the context of a computer, has left me in this similar place of, oh, you wind up just lecturing or doing a seminar in a kind of vague or general sense, where you've always already began the lecture, and there was no moment where I was simply preaching, simply acting, simply advertising. It was all tacitly on the level of the lecture, and the lecture itself was the providing of the subject matter of how it was impossible to give a lecture from the beginning. So again, this is an instance of something being accomplished on the way. But I think I'm still pressed to have to do some philosophizing, because it's one thing to wind up in this position of saying, oh, it's lecturing, and to just kind of default lazily to being like, oh, I did all the lecturing on the way here. I don't have to actually give you any philosophical content. It's all actually been generated on the way. No, in part this is a setting of the conditions of the way that I think philosophy is done, so that we can have this conversation now, or this positing of a conversation now as to what I think philosophy is, or what it's moving towards, without giving away a kind of capital P, in advance we know what philosophy is kind of description. So to do some philosophy now, and not merely to set the stage for it implicitly along the path, I want to ask, what does a better way presuppose? If there is a better way that life could be lived, if there's a better way to think, if there's a better way to think and communicate and relate to people, and we call that philosophy, what does philosophy presuppose? What has to be there in the mix to some extent? And this is going to be a kind of open-ended question, because I think it presupposes a lot. There are questions that I'm still generally tarrying with, where it's like, what had to be rightly set up and presupposed just for you to be able to think, or something like that. So this kind of question about what is a better way presuppose, or what do you have to be capable of doing if this better way can be actualized. Those questions won't wholly be answered here. They're part of the attempt to have an ongoing conversation about what it means to be able to presuppose that there is such a better way, and presuppose what the kind of conditions or components or aspects of that better way might be. So, sorry, just to continue from droning on, I think one of the things that a better way presupposes that we all have the capacity to commune. So one thing is, oh, you want to commune, you want to come out and relate in this atmosphere. In some sense, you presuppose that that's a possibility that could be accomplished. That we could have this kind of qualitative traditional existence alongside each other, where philosophers who are self-enculturating learn and know how to show others how to do that, and also bring others into the fold so that they can do that. We presuppose the capacity to be able to do that when we take up philosophy as a way of life or as a project. We also presuppose that we have the capacity to change ourselves. So if there's an idea of a better way, or even the possibility of a better way, that we could, in some sense, snap out of our current way and go down the other direction of the better way, we're presupposing that we have the capacity to change. So, like, for example, there's obviously all kinds of problems with closed-mindedness in this destitute time, where if you present an idea, it may not be accepted or entertained by somebody even. And if you present an idea that you think we all ought to have the parameters of understanding to be able to accept, you don't understand why the other person doesn't just immediately kind of update or change their worldview to be able to get along with it, to be able to make sense of the new fact, so to speak. So, like, it's curious, and some people are curious when, oh, I have this reliable scientific method that, for example, is producing knowledge about climate change, and I want you to look at this climate change data and update what you think of the world. So if you don't believe in it, for example, and somebody shows you data that suggests that it's a real thing, why is it that the people don't immediately update? And what does it mean for philosophy that some people, when they're presented with new facts, they just know what to do with that, so as to arrive at a new picture of the world? That there's a kind of cognitive map that can be filled out or referenced, that you are in some peculiar and tacit way in control of and responsible for. That's something that I think philosophers presuppose because they've just wound up being capable of being those kind of people. Like when you learn Descartes for the first time and you're a naive or amateur philosopher, you can spook yourself with the idea that it's just you and the whole world's just you stuck in your head, or a solipsism like that. So you can have these kind of like high moments of being able to give yourself a certain kind of reality with your imagination, but then at the same time, the imagination can be this block that prevents you from having to update your cognitive picture. So in some sense, we presuppose that we have the capacity to change ourselves, and that capacity to change ourselves can follow some kind of objective developmental structure, that when you have a better and better science, we can all get on the same page about how and why that better and better science actually is the better and better one, as opposed to arguing over whether we're on the same page about the same science and whether it's actually better. So questions as to why some people don't do that or aren't very good at that, and questions as to why some people are really good at that, y'all have a role to play here. People who are really good at it, in some sense, it's like, okay, it's not then a matter of which of these worldviews that you could fit yourself into, or which of these facts that you use to update your worldview. For these people, it's a matter of what do you make of yourself self-consciously as that thing that's capable of switching between all of these particular worldviews. It's a kind of philosophical subjectivity that's capable of charitably entertaining multiple worldviews. Why are some people good at that? And how do they have a role to play in the building of philosophical communities? Another presupposition about what a better way presupposes is that the hurt and the pain that we feel when we change is in some sense supposed to be a good thing. That I've heard it said, when you update your worldview, it's painful. When you have an idea about love that is contradicted by a bad breakup, or by learning something that you didn't want to learn about love, it hurts. It's painful to update. So like if you live in bliss about how the earth is going to last for, or human life on earth is going to last for another 1,000,000 years because the climate's going to be lovely, to learn that the climate is changing in dangerous ways, that's something that's scary. That's something that is painful and hurts to learn. But then, so there are people who admittedly aren't good at updating their worldviews because why? In part, it hurts. But then you have these oddballs on the other side who are really good at it, who are supposedly capable and willing to undergo this hurt. So one of the presuppositions about philosophical life is that this hurt that we're encountering when we encounter new facts and new ways of thinking is in some sense good, because it's not so much merely a matter of being able to contend with them and fit them into your worldview, but learning how to be that philosophical gaze that appropriately switches between each of those worldviews and facts. In a sense, there's a kind of want for pain here, a kind of desire to be in despair for the sake of getting to that better and better worldview. I think philosophy in particular, maybe religion, has that kind of disposition. Lastly, we presuppose that it's possible to actually come to recognize each other at some point in time, that this won't just forever be a kind of ongoing project, that it won't just be an ongoing matter of, are you in the tradition now? Are you in the tradition now? When do we know how to stop approximating? Are you allowed to stop reading texts here because now you should have gotten it, or something like that? We presuppose that there's an actual endpoint, that philosophy as such can be done and is actual, that a way of life that knows that it does not know is possible and actual. So I think I'm approaching an end here, finally. Some of the reasons that I was asked to do this, to continue on with before, was like, people have approached me in person for life advice because of the kind of things that they think a philosopher is and does. I'm not saying that that was wrong or peculiar of them to do. I'm just saying that this is one of the caricatures of the philosopher that people who have or exude this philosophical spirit deal with. They suppose that, oh, people need life advice, and you gave me decent advice this one time, or something like that. Or you framed the problem really well for me, and people need assistance with that. I totally agree. It's just a matter of like, is that all that a philosopher is and does? And can they do something like that in advance? Can you know who the philosopher is so as to go to them for properly philosophical life advice? So kind of what I'm trying to get at here is that when you go to a philosopher, you're in some sense presupposing the kind of advice that you're going to get. And and we don't know that because we don't have a notion of philosophy in our time. Other people have asked me to do this video or this channel because they, like I said before, want there to be more critical thinking or more exposure to critical thought. But I can't just right out the gates give you a kind of expose as to what is critical thinking, what is rationality, what is logic, are you critically thinking? I'm not so sure that a rubric like that exists in advance. So I'm paying all kinds of costs by continuing to claim that philosophy is a way of life. So this is going to be very, very qualitative, an attempt to be other than the current technological, quantitative, privileging way of doing something like philosophy as a critical thinker. I've also been asked to do this because people in the university and people outside the university are pissed at the way that the university itself functions. So not only are there appropriate criticisms of the way that the university is mediated by capital and economics, but there's a way that the university is mediated by charlatans, by people who don't really know their craft very well, or who are handing on their craft without overly considering the theoretical bases for their involvement in it, or even their personal involvement in it. So it's like, hey, somebody needs to crack the whip on shitty academics and over making philosophy something that's over academic. I hope to be able to do that. I don't have anything witty to say in that regard, I guess. Lastly, it's another, just to reiterate, it's a matter of raising the bar for discourse. And all of these things can't be done in advance. I don't know what it looks like to, hey, here's the problem in the academy, and I'm going to tell you what it is. Or I'm going to tell you what critical thinking or life advice is. Or I'm going to tell you what this bar is going to look like in advance. The whole point of these being problems in our destitute time is that they're qualitative in nature, and that we live in a time when they're only thought of quantitatively, non-philosophically. So I can't do these kind of things in advance. I can only continue to teach by example, by being alongside you. And that's again why I hate this. Because in person it's so much easier. If we were persistently exposed to each other, a weekly philosophy club kind of thing, anything like that, I think that you'd get what I have to say more easily. I think I'd be capable of representing myself better. It'd be a persona here asking me questions and not having to follow out the mere line of thought that I'm capable of tracing out. So it's a dislike for the medium, where I think that philosophy subject matter is life and human life, human life and its individuality. Sorry, I think that philosophy's subject matter is a community of individuals who know themselves. And part of the problem that I've tried to speak to thus far is that it's impossible to have a community, possibly impossible to have a community in this kind of medium, because I don't know who I'm speaking to. So I'm in this odd place where I'm wittingly subjecting myself to something that I think is a contradiction, where I want community, I want philosophical community, I would like there to be more philosophical community in the world, but then I'm in a medium that has me talking to nobody. And in a sense, philosophy may or may not be capable of passing over into being a tradition again, ever, maybe. Because, it's a question whether flames can be lit online like that. It's a question of whether we could get on the same page about certain rites of passage where, for example, by the time you're 16, you need to have internalized Descartes, so that whenever somebody references that line of thinking or that point in history, we all just know the same page and the ontological consequences of thinking like that or something. So it's like what the rites of passage are, what the pedagogical moments are, how to sees periods of time in a person's life when they need to hear certain things or need to avoid certain things. So moments of initiation are things that are things that are supposed to be present in a tradition that at this point in time aren't. Philosophy, though, has the possibility of being this kind of tradition because it has historic individuals and seminal texts. So like a religion who has their apostles or saints on the walls or on the glass or in painting or something like that, philosophy has its historical individuals and seminal texts on the shelves being taught in classrooms still. So it is a tradition, but it's one that is continuing to define itself. So like this is part of that like qualitative quantitative destitution where philosophy is something that defines itself as its community of individuals. So the community of individuals as such define what philosophy is and how it functions and whether when one acts philosophy is being done or not. To me, as far as I can tell, philosophy is the sphere, the space within which people do that self-consciously as a tradition. So again, to reiterate, it's not a theory, but it's the lives of individuals thought out. Almost like a pun there, where it's from their thought to actuality together. So I'm not going to come out and tell you my thoughts and interests and my thinkers who have affected me. I'm glad to do something like that, but ultimately the goal of community is not that, because it's a matter of getting on the same page in thought by being able to recognize what thought is and when somebody is thinking. So it's not a matter of me telling you these things in advance so that you can get a kind of picture of my persona that you can carry up to me and then find me intelligible within. I have to continually put my persona forth systematically and comprehensively in a spirited philosophical way. I have to show you who I am by embodying my thinking as that first moment of vulnerably putting myself forth for no apparent reason at all. Not by giving you edification with a new theory or new imaginations or a new world, but just putting myself forth, and at the same time not really having anything new to say. I'm not sure that I've said anything overly fresh, overly interesting, overly new. Reason that I'm not writing is not only because I think that everything that I would say in writing has already been said, but because I am continually trying to play the inverse side of the quantitative thought, where it's not a matter of handing over a book or a show or a series of shows or lectures like that. It's a matter of presenting a persona as a way of life. So I can't give you anything. I can't give you theory. Can't even really give you a good ending at this point in time, because I got to this point in thinking just organically and spilling it out on paper, and then realizing that I'd been writing for a while and needed to get to speaking. Soft ending.